So the overall prompt for our workshop is, okay, suppose it's 2040 and we live in a world which in which we've beat climate change. So try to envision what life might be like and what is most important to you in this life. We definitely want to walk through the workshop itself, but considering what this group is, we thought it would be interesting to do an overview of how we arrived here. And again, please feel free to ask questions. So this is climate change is obviously one of the many wicked problem spaces to work in. And as you likely know, a wicked problem is intertwined with many other systemic problems and is one in which there's no really right or wrong answers. And it's more like what is maybe a little worse or a little better. So and also, as you know, well, this discursive methods and design are such well-suited tools for reflection and unpacking wicked problems. And developing this workshop, we took this critical discursive lens to unpack the systemic roots of climate change. And so this was the inspiration for our team name. The wicked problem of climate change can often feel insurmountable and hopeless, but in order to create change, we really have to believe that it's possible to change. And with this project, we've strived to help others conceptualize this problem and to expand imaginaries and possible futures. And above all, we wanted to provide some hope. So we found that there was already plenty of doom and gloom in the climate space. So we wanted to try to aim for this, sort of like hopeful, fun thing. But creating hope doesn't mean manufacturing blind optimism and suggesting that everything will be fine. Instead, for us, it means providing those concerned about climate change with tools to help them feel just like a little bit less overwhelmed in the chaos. So the initial formative research we used were subject matter interviews. And then also we did a mixed methods survey that had 22 questions related to the climate crisis, and we analyzed 153 responses. And the co-design sessions we first held were 4 early sort of formative sessions, and it really informed what our workshop became. And then also just throughout the project, we participated in the climate movement ourselves, and just first offline, and then online. So Kyle did this amazing deep dive on analyzing the data. That could be an entire presentation by itself. But one of the impactful findings that we found is that there's this huge range of interests that people have within the climate movement. Like, we had 153 survey respondents, and they were involved in 96 different climate-related organizations. And for our SMEs, we reached out to local environmentalists, community organizers, and leaders from nonprofits, and many of these were focused on equity in their communities. Then we did these co-design sessions, and there was this really great positive energy we got from getting people together and talking about climate issues and sort of talking about solutions. But we had some sort of unfortunate recruiting, and we ended up with all white viewpoints. And we really, it really made us realize that even though some systemic issues were starting to crop up even within this group, we knew that we were missing this huge swath of the lenses that people bring to climate crisis. And so this really led us to develop this discursive workshop. So as many of you are aware, or probably everybody, there has been a lot of recent conversations about systemic racism as it relates to police brutality in the United States. And systemic racism also plays this huge role in climate change. Black, Indigenous, and other frontline communities are really disproportionately affected by climate issues. However, the mainstream climate movement often excludes these people. And particularly like these frontline community activists who are trying to shed light on the deep-rooted systemic issues rather than on quick solutions or technological fixes. So this led us to reframe this sort of divisiveness of the climate change movement into diversity, and perhaps finding where you fit into the climate movement is really key. So this is our journey map, which shows like the happy path that folks might take to find where they could fit in within the climate movement. And this path involves like critical reflexive inquiry to explore your personal values and to understand where your voice will be the most valued.
Sorry, Dinah, could you go back
Yeah.
just 2 slides, I think it is now, one more, that one. That idea that we don't we don't really share one climate is that's deep. Just situating the context in which people experience, and it's so obvious, but stated. I mean, I hadn't thought about it really before in those terms. Like you can definitely, it's pretty easy if you dig into it I mean, imagine that in the context of, the structures and institutions that kind of enforce particular ways of experiencing the world, in the context of like social relations, like racism in one context. And I know that definitely it's easy to, I mean, it's a compelling argument to make that is also exhibited in the context of, I guess the exposure to the consequences of climate change. But we often think of the climate as like one thing that we all experience because it's the outside world, and it's the ocean, and we sort of share our experiences around it. You can't like, my ocean is different from yours, but to a large degree, that makes it clear that actually that's incomplete.
Yeah,
that's really
definitely. And the more you start looking for that, the more you'll find evidence. It's just that it's not always on the front page of everything. It's not on the first screen. So it's definitely been a really serious eye opener for me. And it's really a rich space. And to think about, to like add into just like the issues that a lot of Black people are having around like COVID-19, there's been some interesting podcasts on like, why is that happening? And it's kind of related to sort of these same like environmental degradation issues. So it is all super intertwined in a way that's really fascinating. So yeah, please feel free, anybody, to jump in with stuff like that, because it's really helpful to see what's hitting people too.
I wanted to make a comment. I don't know if you all know each other, so I just saw it in a Slack that it was shared, and I thought it was pretty interesting. So my name is Laura. I'm from Colombia, but I'm doing a master in London.
Oh, great.
And for my thesis, I'm researching the future of work and how can we redefine work.
Fantastic.
And also tackle climate change at the same time. And one of the things that I have been reading is about how can we design from the pluriverse, and how this idea of climate change, it's a Western idea, that it's not included the global South. So to your point, when you were saying something about the Black communities and indigenous communities, we also have to be careful and think on, okay, the consequences of climate change is the Industrial Revolution that actually lead us to this point. So many people, like in Colombia and in countries like Brazil, things like that, they feel that it's our time to develop, and it's almost a new way of colonialize and determine the future, just saying like, okay, now you have to switch to an energy that it's gonna cost you more. And that's like the thought. Mm-hmm. So how can we break that and try to build a thought that it's different, that it's actually like revolutionary, like we all live in the same planet, but from the acknowledgement that the development that all these first world countries was the cause, or the principal cause, or the main cause of climate change, and in the state that we are. Yeah. So I think it's comparable to what you were saying, to the systemic racism. It's an acknowledgement that this is wrong, we participated, and we actually did it, and how can we make a change together, rather than imposing a change because we now want to switch to a different thing, right? So yeah.
Do you know the whole solar punk movement?
No.
Okay, so you have to dive into that. We'll give you a little, we have a thing on that, but I think it would be very enlightening for you and helpful.
Thank
in
you
your
very
work.
much.
So yeah, because it kind of is looking at that and responding to it in a very not colonized way.
Totally.
So,
One of the important takeaways in this too, just kind of at this point where we're talking, is really the difference between empathy and involvement. There's a lot of empathy. Oh, I feel bad for what's going to happen to these frontline communities. I don't think you're going to run out of hearing that statement across a lot of topics in sort of this wicked problem spaces. I feel for those others who will be suffering. I won't be suffering, but they will first. And the natural response is, oh, okay, well, they think about them, they care about them. Well, if you cared about them, you'd involve them. And so that's a big part of this process, is how do you involve them in part of the process? Not that they're even participants, but they're also facilitators. That was a kind of a takeaway I had was, if you look at participatory action research methods, you involve those frontline communities as facilitators of these sessions like we're going to show you today. And that being important as well is having them part of leadership, and not just that they're involved at a base level. So you just keep going up the hierarchy of involvement. They go from being a participant to being involved as a facilitator to being a leader. And now you start to get into where some of the systemic issues are, is, well, they're involved, but they're not involved in the same capacity as others are. And that's a problem as well.
yeah, cool. I'm not going to go into detail on this slide that's up right now, but that would be another thing interesting for you to look at, Laura, is the causal layered analysis, like as another way of sort of exploring these different levels that things hit people at, and kind of where the solutions fall, like based on what kind of level you're dealing with. So here's the Solarplunk slide for you. So Solarpunk's a speculative genre that's focused on these positive futures of the post-climate crisis. And it has this as distinct aesthetic quality that's inspired by Art Nouveau and is characterized by this intentional blending of art and function in built environments. So examples of real-life solarpunk would be like in resilient communities such as Puerto Rico's makeshift solar networks in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria. And from a Western perspective, like indigenism and traditional indigenous technologies that can also be an example of this sort of real life solar punk. So it really is talking about a pretty radical shift in our relationship between nature and technology. So, and then these were the things that really directly inspired our future visioning workshop. Some that you may or may not be familiar with. There's the Art Symbiotic Life, which is a discursive project that was grounded in the SSPs that are just directly to the right of that. And the Shared Socioeconomic Pathways, or SSPs, they're a set of scenarios developed by an international coalition of climate experts. They're utilized by policy experts like the IPCC for analyzing policies like the Paris Agreement. And then the Superflux's Instant Archetypes is a future visioning toolkit, and a Where Do You Stand mapping game by Stuart Candy and Peter Hayward that was then further iterated on by Superflux is another example. And then CMU's Carnegie Mellon University's metaphor cards that are used to help spark sort of inspiration. So for the design of the thing itself, our goals were that we really wanted to help people envision these positive, climate change futures that match their values. And we wanted to be really fun and free thinking, because so much about climate change is really depressing and doom and gloom. Then we also designed it for people who want to see climate issues as systemic issues and as part of a diverse movement. So we ended up holding 8 workshops over 3 weeks, and we just kept iterating it through this whole time. And actually one of our deliverables for our project was a guidebook, and we kind of like in the guidebook are encouraging people to keep iterating, because there's just this project that can keep going and going. So obviously we did this during the COVID era, so it was necessity that it's all online. So we used Miro and Zoom for whiteboarding, collaboration, and communication. We found that as it stands, it takes about 90 minutes to run it effectively. And we, for this part, focused on small groups because we really wanted to do some rich experiences. So we did it with just 2 to 5 participants at a time. But again, we're thinking there's ways that that can grow and expand. And another key factor for us was that we found that it was really helpful to have us as facilitators like be involved in the co-creation, because it just gave the whole thing more energy. And not like you're a dominant force, but that it just was helpful for getting the energy up. And then we used, let's see, we had a few warm-up activities that you first came to on the Miro board, and it was intended to both serve as an introduction tool as well as a conversation starting point. We had people write down the 3 words that come to mind when they describe their feelings about climate change and place them on a mapping game. And then these are the 3 sort of base scenarios that we developed. These were like kind of the jumping off places for people to create narratives about. And so these are all grounded in those same 3 of the 5 SSPs, which is sort of like what that other person's discursive project did, like 4 or 5 of them, and kind of like took them in a different direction. But for us, we had the first one that's on the left, it's Green on Demand, and it takes this more product-oriented, market-based approach to solving climate change. It's probably the most like kind of where we're really at this point. And then the one in the middle is called A Walled Garden, and it's based on a focus on localized economies with strong borders. And it sort of plays off of nationalism, but it's toned down. And then the third one is Radical Symbiosis, which is more fully based on inclusivity, collectivism, and harmony with nature. And as I was putting this together today, I was like, it reminds me of that Chaz Chop area that's in Seattle right now. It's like this wild experiment of like, what happens if we don't have police and everyone's taking care of each other? So it's kind of like a real life workshop. So the other elements, we ended up using some of the CMU metaphor cards, and we added some specifically in that were like about plants because we thought that was appropriate for metaphorical questions for this. And then we developed a series of questions to make the future life feel more tangible for people, but also to raise questions about ethics and equity of these new worlds. And so during the sessions, we would have someone pick a scenario to start with of those last 3, pick one of these metaphor cards, and then pick a couple of questions to then build a narrative around. And we encourage people to like sort of hop into each other's narratives and like add to them, so that people were sort of mixing and matching around the different stories they were creating on the board. Let's see. So this is kind of what the Miro board, like the working space of the Miro board looks like. So we have the prompt at the top, and then this is like just like one section where it has just one of the scenarios and gives some just like visual cues, so you can start to use it as a jumping off point, but like not have it be so heavy-handed that it's like, oh, I have to think of those elements, like trying to keep it really open, encouraging people to pick a question that maybe they were really interested in, and then also to pick one that would be more like a challenge for them, one that would really, challenge where they were coming from. And then just sort of start putting together these stories in the center. And so they could, cut and paste things in. They also, as you can see, this is one that actually Kyle and Julie and I did, but we, you could bring in just like things from, just things from the web that just helped inform what you were thinking, or just create a bunch of stickies to do stories, or put on icons to sort of like emphasize things, or even to do drawings. It was really, really fun to do. So, and I can switch over to some of the other things, but what we ended up doing as our deliverable for the project was we collected all of the results from the workshop. So we put it into a big like kind of book, and online book, and then it's just sort of like this living thing that could be added to. And then we also sent it to the people who joined our workshop, so that we could just have it become like a reflection piece that they could respond to. And and just this is some feedback that we got. Like, but basically people were super enthusiastic. We got some feedback that wanted it to even go more heavily into the ethics than where we did. So we ended up actually iterating on that at that point and adding more ethics questions into it, which was really cool to get that feedback. And yeah, oh, so we have some, oh, and actually I think you do have the chat open today, so I could put those in if you would like. Oh, I don't have access to my chat right now, but I don't know if Julie, would you be able to do that? Do you see that? Can you get into? Oh, okay. Oh, thanks. So the little mini website, the Solastalgia card, has also some other links too, if you're interested. And anyway, that's kind of it in a nutshell. I could show you the Miro board if you want to see that. I could show you some of the anthology if you want to see what people came up with, the kinds of things they did. What would be interesting?
Hey, this is Scott. Thanks a lot for sharing all that. I'm in the midst of, not on climate, but doing similar work with groups and using Miro. So I love seeing all the, I think this group really likes sharing methods. I didn't know about some that you shared. Just really dumb, simple question. Was the time horizon, was it 2040? Just curious how you talked about that, how you came up with that, how that wasn't part of the workshop emphasis, because that can be such an issue, is getting people to step outside of today. Yeah. Or anything close to today.
I think we were consciously trying to keep it ironically near future, so that it just didn't feel so far away. That it would felt like they had to invent something that like was impossible, but things are happening so quickly now that it felt like it was still pretty far out. So it was really kind of just like a process of elimination that we ended up at 2040. I think weirdly, one of our first co-design, oh no, never mind. I'm going to walk that back.
I guess the other thing that would be handy is, as much as I think I understand the, and again, that was a lot of materials in a short period of time, but
I know it was like a 6 months of work.
I'm like, I'm not familiar enough with it to be like, okay, I'm following.
I agree.
I guess maybe if it's possible, did you have a slide where it was like, you said you guys did it as you were showing an example of you doing it. I guess maybe tell, what did, how did it kind of end? I'm trying to understand.
Yeah, maybe I'm gonna, let me see if I can easily, if I can switch.
In other words, what did you get people to say or do, or?
Yeah, so what we asked people to do, just like in a nutshell, and I might actually see if I can share a different screen. Let's see if I can.
Early on, one of the points that we thought was interesting was, when we were first doing the co-design session and it was still sort of evolving, we had quite a diverse age range in one of the sessions, and we had folks collaborating that would otherwise probably not collaborate based on their interest in organization involvement. And one of the takeaways we found was that just like the catalyst between two people of very different generations starting to collaborate, and one person who we thought was very firm in their ideas and had a lot of experience in climate change work actually flopped over to the younger individual's idea and started to work to build that out. So their takeaway was just the collaboration itself, having the opportunity to just work together in a collective manner. And I think just being outside their normal bubble of involvement, and that opened our eyes. And then we took like some perspectives of, wow, we need to broaden it even further, because, you know, as Dinah mentioned, we had quite a bit of white involvement in the beginning. But that was kind of the first nugget that showed us that we were on to something. And just bringing people together in these little small groups and having them go through facilitated workshops was something to just help them with problem solving and sort of getting out of the rut of being in their own experience over and over again. So how do you get these other organizations, these other interests to start collaborating?
Also, like,
Sorry.
oh, sorry. Yeah, one thing I wanted to add is at some of our later sessions, we wanted to try to do an intentional reflection to get people to think about, okay, so you've been through these scenarios that have different worldviews. How does that relate to you? And so one of our participants, for example, her background was in industrial design, and she said that the green on demand world really reminds her of that world, but she's now moving into landscape architecture, and she kind of wants to use a lot of the principles that she found in scenario C, in the symbiosis scenario. So like in that particular case, like she actually found a way to get those values that are embedded in each worldview and see how it relates to like her career path. But really, yeah, it was an exercise in just like expanding your worldviews and thinking outside of the norm. Like, if you want to solve climate change, like let's think outside of just let's build a new product to do this, to like, you know, outside of electric cars or whatever. So we found that reflection element was really crucial. And we wish we would have had a little more time to iterate on that, but I think that kind of tied everything up.
I mean, it really took into the concept of thinking critically and what that actually means at its root. You know, we think of that phrase as a phrase that everyone on this conversation and this meeting has heard. Think critically. We need critical thinking. Students need more critical thinking, blah, 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 blah. But when you actually look at like the roots of what critical thinking is and why that word is, it's not because of seriousness. So that actually, when you go into like critical theory and how you're starting to look at the socio-cultural issues involved in it, you start to get deeper and deeper. And that was the goal of this. Like, how do we get them kind of past that superficial stuff into this critical thinking? And discursive is very reflective. So, you know, an important part of this is how do you get people not just to act, but to reflect on that action, to acknowledge the biases that they have in, to acknowledge their own position in society and how that may affect their own perception of this issue. So it's equally as important for them to generate ideas as it is for them to reflect on why they may be generating them, if that makes sense. You know, when we're hopping between like collectivist looking nationalism and all that, if that makes sense. That's a lot to unpack, but like there's a lot in there that we start to get into, like on why this issue again is very challenging to approach. And how we have to sort of push people to acknowledge their own perspective and reach outside of that perspective.
One really thoughtful observation that one of the participants had afterwards when she sent us comments was that in the three scenarios, she didn't envision her life being that different, but that how people treated each other was different. And so it really feels like that hit this like human compassion space in a really nice way. Just thinking through, you know, just our constructs and like how we interact with each other. It really, I feel like the thing that was so exciting about this workshop is kind of like how it made people think and feel differently after they did it. And it wasn't like our artifacts that were produced are like really fun and cool, but it's like really the thing that people got was what they took away.
Yeah, I'm getting now the better, thanks for all that. I'm getting the impression now more clearly that the role of the scenarios, plus kind of the preamble slides you shared, and then what you're showing here is kind of, in order to tackle these things, we have to expand the mindsets that we're bringing to these situations. I guess that answers my question about this stuff that's on the right of these boards. Is that activity? No. Like the post-it photo.
Oh, yeah.
I'm like, okay, that's what people were doing. Is they were like, essentially, how is my, like you just said, the dimension of social interaction, how communal has my attitude been about blah, blah, blah.
Exactly. Yeah.
That it's almost like a primer. Like if you want to work on this issue, you need to do these kinds of things, this kind of exercise first.
Yeah, for sure.
Would you please?
Yeah, we were thinking it could be really cool for community groups that are wanting to work on stuff like this to just get them into a good mind space.
Yeah, I mean, this is, it also, where were people? Were they, is this strictly in the Western US? Northwest?
Let's see, I think we did end up using, because we were using kind of connections to do this at this point, like, so Seattle, we pretty much.
Seattle and California.
Oh yeah, California too.
I'm wondering, Kyle, you're describing the kind of dynamic that happened between someone who's maybe more seasoned in this space and then kind of younger participant. Those kind of dynamics are really fascinating to me, and they're kinds of things I really like to hear when those happen. Is there any more detail about that? Like even just to understand what was the quote unquote old guard perspective that the youngin was introducing a new set of sensibilities, because part of I think one of the challenges that that we oftentimes face and that I want to figure out how best to approach are how you unlock people's sense of I know what's right or I know what the future is, and move them into that space where all of a sudden like all their kind of all their kind of pre-built in kind of wiring about how the world works is they're like stunned into submission to accept that there are other ways of seeing the world. Sometimes I refer to it in it's not the kindest term, but just like going into a room and just blowing everything up. Like forget what you thought you knew. Let's start from scratch. And so I'm curious to hear about that.
So to go into that example, so what was the idea that inspired? The younger individual brought up gamification, and the older individual, so young, just relative. Now, I'm not going into stereotype there, but just it'll help you to follow the perspective there. We had a lot of like firm ideas that we thought were going to continue on to the next round of iteration, and I was like, okay, this person's definitely. They were even saying, I'm going down this path. And then the younger individual brought up gamification, and we asked everyone, okay, you went through this first iteration of sort of brainstorming. You're going to go through a second, and you're going to latch onto an idea and work further on that. And we're like, okay, this person's going definitely down this path that they've already mentioned, and they made a total switch and went with the gamification and followed the younger individual on that to help build that out. So they took their experience and helped to sort of explore a new area, something of interest. Maybe just because it was new. So, I mean, it was really fascinating. I mean, if any of you are going to end up experiencing this, I highly recommend it. You learn a lot more about what this is by truly being in it. I can say that because I needed that to understand it a bit more. You end up exhausted. Like, I mean, because the way we frame it, you sort of have to get out of your perspective so much that you like, I don't know, the wheels start turning, steam starts coming out of your ears. And the thing we found at the end was like there was a huge need for reflecting to be able to evaluate the takeaways, because your brain is going so fast you're not able to sort of, you leave the session and be like, I'm not sure what I took away from this other than I'm exhausted. And so we had to add that in. So you take the time for people to sort of look at what they did and what they took away from it and be intentional about that, so that they're left with something. Yeah, so I think that's a huge part of this, like understanding that reflection is much more needed in society than I think I ever realized. Because just because you're being productive doesn't mean you're able to sort of grasp that takeaway. Because I found in my experience, retrospectives sort of are a glanced over thing. You know, you do them, but you like the amount of seriousness you put into like what kind of depth you go in reflection is not as much as the kind of the main activity. So.
And I think like you can't overlook just like in this, we've seen it again and again, when you get people together who aren't usually together and they start talking about issues or start talking about things, but they're like kind of in a more intimate setting, and it's not something where they are in a camp. They're just people that like right away that opens up all this like energy and, you know, considering what people are saying to people that are right, you know, like right in the same workshop with them. We don't choose to do that often, I think, you know, in society. So if you have something like this that kind of forces you to do that, then there's just a lot of surprising stuff that can happen.
I like this the point you were making, Kyle, about those moments of reflection, because it makes me think of like a session like a long time ago where we talked about the importance of like patience, and this idea that you don't yet know what the outcome might be, even at the end of the workshop, even after the kind of debrief or the post-mortem. Like oftentimes things come back to you in these profound ways quite a bit later. Like it needs to marinate, and sometimes like not even deliberately.
True. Yeah, I mean, I think Raphael's point in the chat is kind of what we're getting at is this moment of metacognition, of actually thinking through your own process. Like, I know we often think so concretely, like, I know what I did. Do you? Because when you go into these moments of conscious and unconscious behavior, there's a lot you skip. And it's amazing, you know, if I was going to, I'm going on my own ideas here. If I was going to incorporate something, I'd actually have someone watch their own session, you know, and entirely. You know, so they go through it and then they watch it and see kind of that evolution and see how you receive that. I mean, it seems like, well, what would they gain out of it? They were there. Exactly. Would they? And I found that that's actually a strong thing to do, is have someone watch sort of the evolution of their group and sort of see things happen as a way of explaining this process. I mean, if we showed you all a recording of one of these sessions, you would learn more about this process. If you saw a recording of yourself, you would also learn about this process. So just a thing. I've seen that method kind of growing over time. It's not become very popular quite yet, but I do think that sort of reflecting on your own experience equally as going through the experience will become more popular in the future.
Yeah, I think having a it's not always practical or possible, but having someone whose role is to be the just kind of like observing but not participating, and observing with the purpose of trying to look at all the as Raphael referred to it, so the metacognition, like what is going on here at the level of not the topic per se, but the way in which people are engaging and developing their kind of whatever their epistemology of what's going on here is super helpful. And I think that's even a role like organizationally, like not just in workshops. I feel like there should be some role like EVP of like what the hell's going on here kind of thing, who's not involved in the actual work, and their stakes are not in owning the P&L or these kinds of things. They're just kind of there to observe and discern, and almost like an analyst in a way. Like I don't care about the work per se. What I care about is how the work is done and how we think. And wait a minute, that's groupthink over there. Careful of that. Like just those kinds of observations.
I mean, I'm curious if in your slides, you showed some 2x2 called Novak, Dora. I don't know. I don't remember the name of the diagram where people plotted how I feel in control of my futures, I'm hopeful or wary, or something like that. And as a way to locate them where they currently are. Yeah, that one.
Yeah.
Have you considered giving them a persona that is not them as a vehicle for, I mean, there's all kinds of ways that that's done when designing for today, let alone the future. To use Julian's metaphor, exploding your current mindset. It's something I'm trying to do right now. I have for each future, you're experiencing the future through somebody, not yourself, who's a person who's most impacted by that future. So you, as a way to try and check all of the participants' bias or privilege in those, in looking at those.
Yeah.
Oh, pull lock in, thanks.
So,
Yeah,
I mean,
that sounds great.
the thing about that you have to caution is there's a lot of scrutiny over simulation when we cross into that realm. So if you go into thinking too deeply about someone's perspective, for example, the one that comes to mind for me is people wearing a blindfold to simulate being blind. You don't want to go that far, because now we start to go into, I am getting insights from my own experience of trying to mimic someone. So I think there is kind of a point where we have to be careful about giving someone a persona for that reason, is that there's a lot of systemic racism issues right now would go out in how there's a lot of scrutiny over white involvement in these initiatives. So that would be the only thing I would caution about that approach, and is that you could go into dangerous territory where you then forget to involve and listen to those other perspectives. Instead, you try and absorb them through your own cognition, if that makes sense. So
yeah, I was at IDEO for a long time, and I've been seeing a lot of people are taking shots at them now about what you just described. And the whole purpose of doing the blindfold for 10 minutes is that, okay, now you're open to like 10 weeks of like better understanding, and then involving that person in a way that you wouldn't have before. So
I've been through simulation, and it's been a great experience, and it's actually been something that got me interested in accessibility. I went through one of those very immersive workshops led by an entire collection of blind facilitators, but see, there's the difference. Led by blind facilitators who are showcasing it, and it's not a matter of, it is empathy generation, and I hate to say empathy is a terrible thing. It's just you can't forget the other half, which is involvement. So even in our session, like even us hosting our own session can't always be that way. We have to get other people in those frontline communities to be facilitators of this session and see kind of what directions it goes then, rather than saying, oh, we are the gatekeepers because this is our idea. That perpetuates kind of many of the problems we have today, which is I'm a privileged human being. I happen to be a white male, which doesn't help. And so now I'm saying I own this way of facilitating to talk to you about your issues, and that just perpetuates the problem. And it's really like hard for me to grasp it, because I feel like now we're going deeper and deeper the rabbit hole. And I think that's the point in this session, is you'll find the discussion starts getting so deep into core issues that when you reflect on it, you'll start to see your biases and motivations in possibly uncomfortable ways. Like what is affecting you? Like, I know one of the things that we noticed in our session, I don't know if when we were kind of going through the Miro board, is we had like Elon Musk and like Jeff Bezos, and you could start to see like we had this perspective of kind of the power and influence of money in this perspective. So yeah, it starts to get into like, it's equally an exercise about biases and your perspective on things as it is actually the near future. So, and you have to guide people towards that. It's like, yes, we want to know the new future direction, but do you understand the impact you're having already? So I could go way down I'll stop.
I think one thing you just said there that is even more potent now than when you initially described the importance of who the facilitator, like I think you had a slide like the facilitator actively participates. That seemed kind of neutral at the time that you mentioned, or I'm like, yeah, of course. Like, But now what you're saying about why and who that is, as resistance to the, so I'm hearing kind of the criticism of the blindfold type thing is people avoid the uncomfortable reality of actually dealing with somebody who's actually has an impairment or whatever the issue is that's different than you, that people just want to avoid the discomfort, and if they can find some proxy, they'll do it. And therein lies a pretty powerful criticism of the way people are pursuing any of these kinds of challenge. I mean, it doesn't have to be a wicked problem, just any problem. And I think that heightens a lot of that point in your slide of why that's critical to have those participants.
In some of just what we worked at its core is quite simple. You take existing ideas and you combine them in different ways than have been done previously. You know, it's kind of like we take different people who otherwise haven't collaborated and you sort of see what happens. I mean, it's as basic as that. You know, we take existing things, you know, you saw Solar Punk, you saw Pollock Game, and you saw it with these other things. And we sort of, it's a chemical reaction, and you sort of see how that happens and what that creates. I mean, that's, and then you imagine that across different communities starting to work together, different involvement, and that's how the cycle grows. You just trying to be a catalyst for something. And it just so happens that this is a really interesting collection and an approachable way to talk about very sensitive issues. Like, I'm sorry, but like in my experience in the US, I have not found an easy way to talk about socialism. And so this actually will have a discussion about socialism when you're in this session indirectly, like you're not thinking of it as that, but it is that is the scenario. And granted, some biases will come out, and guess what? You're going to reflect on that existence. Like, because it is a positive, like our entire thing is like, we're a positive future in trying to get people out of the hellfire and brimstone. Because it's so easy to just talk about climate change as like all the people whose lives are going to get destroyed. But can you talk about what that future should look like? I mean, that's what's great about this group is like this near future. Like, how do you talk about the near future in such a way that it is a positive thing? How can you talk about, if you have to talk about socialism as a positive thing? It doesn't mean it's the right thing, but can you talk about it as a positive thing and at least think that through? So because we have the different approaches as well. So we have tech innovation, which should be pretty up in the forefront of everyone's mind lately about, you know, being innovative. And that's an obsession lately that folks have. So we do cater to that scenario as well. So everyone gets their turn. I just so happen to like the socialist approach quite a bit because I found that a lot of things that I'm interested in and why the US has problems is because of how individualist we are as a society and how avoidant we are of collectivist ideas because of its communism and all wartime ideology. So I think that kind of stuff to teach people the good in some of these philosophies is a strong thing as well about, you know, the session that Julie and Dinah did a lot of research into these topics to try and draw out.
I have a question. Did you find people like reflecting about their own role and their jobs? Because one thing that I ran a survey for my thesis, and one thing that I found, it's like people, they want to do things, but the idea of reflecting that their actual jobs are impacting negatively the earth, it's really hard for them to understand. So it's more comfortable to say like, hey, I imagine this world in which we can do X and Y, that it's simpler. I can ride a bike, I can do all these things, I can become vegetarian, vegan, whatever. But actually rethinking their work and how that impacts all this topic of climate change is really tough for them. So I wanted to ask you if you found or any conversation related to that, to our roles jobs during the workshop.
Well, I think that's one of the issues that Dinah brought up in about the survey before. That what you're mentioning is a core reason of why our workshop exists, is because of that complexity of interest. You know, we had 153 survey respondents involved in 96 different climate-related organizations. You know, just take a moment to breathe that in. 96 different organizations. All that competition, all that spread out, trying to tackle the same issue. You know, that's a lot. How do you cater to that? How do you address 96 different topics? You know, if we invited 153 people sessions, like how do you do that? It's super complex. And so it's like, okay, well, can you get people to think through different scenarios, or maybe just mash up different things? You know, how do we have an existence that's carbon free and vegan? And like have people go down that rabbit hole for a bit too, and start to get people to think about different things. You know, that they like, not even just socialism. What about veganism? And have people seriously explore that concept. And obviously you're going to have quite a few biases come out, but maybe you're going to have some interesting ideas by combining things you otherwise wouldn't. Because I think I actually had to explain this to some other folks about, because oftentimes we're always so fast. You know, what's the shorter version of this? Can you give me the shorter version? And the point is the natural friction in this session. Like you pick an image or an images, you pick a couple of questions that conflict. You pick a scenario and then you move on to, you know, 2 other scenarios as you go. Like there is a natural tension that gets created by you picking these things. And that's kind of how this works, is the conflict. So I would say, I mean, the goal is, can you just mash these things up like you're saying, and just have people pursue things from a few angles. So maybe not all of them all at once, but maybe a few of them all at once, and see sort of if that friction starts to create insight.
Definitely.
Oh,
yeah, definitely. Go ahead.
Okay. I'm really curious that I really like this idea that you're getting people to model something that's not necessarily of their opinion, and getting them to be comfortable to be in spaces that they don't necessarily agree with. But within the groups that were created, did you have people or individuals with radically different value systems that were struggling to find a common ground to agree across? Because I'm kind of picking on what you were saying, particularly because you're in America, of the distinction between individualism and social kind of leanings. And so I'm curious of the dynamic within a group as people try to navigate scenarios beyond their opinion state, but finding that thread.
For these last workshops, we actually, first of all, people could do their own thing if they wanted to. They didn't have to all agree. They could just sort of build their thing and then talk to everyone about it. So we didn't actually force them to agree on something. In our prior co-design stuff that we did that kind of led to this, we did get into that more. That's what Kyle was touching on, where we had groups that they had to agree on sort of a direction that they were going to go forward with. So we were exposed more to the thing you're talking about. And I think that's where some of the issues that Kyle was bringing up earlier really came through, that people were actually really open to listening to other people's ideas and shifting a bit in sort of how they were thinking. I think because they're in this intimate group and they're kind of like put together. And I think the other thing that Laura was mentioning about how does it reflect people's careers, we actually had such an interesting mix. We had some college students that are like really actively involved in the work that they're doing, or, you know, like the careers they're going into because they want to directly impact this. So there was that. And then there was one person we had who is like someone who had made gobs of money in tech, and was saying that, you know, he sees now that he was part of the problem, quote unquote, not because of our thing, but because he had already arrived to that conclusion. And it's interesting to like think about how these people approach those projects, you know, just projects like this, because he had a very like, there's a solution, we can figure out a solution for this, we just have to make the solution happen. And so it really did bring out these kind of worldviews in a really prominent way. But I mean, it would be interesting, back to the other thing of like trying to get people to build consensus. That would be like a full day workshop, I think, because I think it's amazing how long it takes to just go through this, like in our 90-minute time frame. But I think it would be really interesting to explore the dynamics in that. I mean, just as a sort of furthering idea, I like where that could go.
I think it's a very interesting one, because we were kind of mentioning earlier that you've got these different strands, and on one strand you've got the content or subject matter of the workshop, and then another is the framework or the dynamic and how that's unfolding. And I think that second one's fascinating, of the way in which you can design in advance and then facilitate live, the way you can have paths that are taken by certain cohorts. But it's a complex thing, but it's really interesting.
Yeah.
And then as Kyle was mentioning, the ability as individuals and as a group to reflect back on what that experience was like, and ways in which that could be changed in the future to help steer a different outcome. It's a form of collaborative workshop design, I guess.
Just to provide, a little bit of transparency in this, and how serious this kind of thing can go, and what you have to prepare for when you go in these sessions. You will acknowledge and encounter biases that are not comfortable to acknowledge. Our group encountered one of the most uncomfortable situations we've ever sat in, by having to have an experience where someone found out about their own massive bias, white fragility, and racism. It was deep. We got so deep, you saw something you weren't ready to see, and that really led us to experience something that was horrible. That is something I think, while we're talking about this bright future, you have to realize you may encounter sort of the devil inside you. And that's not always an easy thing for everyone to see. And so I would say, that's an important thing about this process too, why the reflection is important, but to understand that reflection can really hurt. And we weren't exactly able to overcome that as well, because the individual wasn't ready to accept that. So I just think, obviously the thing that would help us going forward is to keep this idea going and have someone building off of it. So 6 months of work, we've built off some other folks' ideas. If folks can continue to build off of our ideas, or to take this session and experience it, and then maybe that carries on to another session. So, I mean, hopefully this thing can continue to evolve. So maybe we can tackle global issues, or maybe the widespread concerns in climate change, because, we only had a 6-month taste of it. And in 6 months, we started to encounter what we did. I mean, I feel like we made a lot of progress, and a lot of folks have a hard time, when we were showing our work, had a hard time sort of grasping what we even did. And that just kind of goes to show, this is a tough space to be in, especially when, you work with someone who ends up finding out they have racist tendencies. So.
I also wanted to add to that, so we came across this concept of the disorienting dilemma and transformative learning. And we didn't really officially incorporate that into our project, but that could be one framework that people use to help guide people towards addressing their own biases. And so certain people, if they have never practiced exploring these different worldviews, and then all of a sudden, somebody comes along and talks about colonialism, it's very, very jarring. It's very disorienting. And that's where, that's where a lot of the defensiveness or the white fragility comes from. And if you throw people into the fire too quickly, it becomes a big backlash. It becomes very, very painful. So that is a limitation of our project. We don't know how to deal with that yet. For this workshop in particular, this this Climate Futures workshop, we did intentionally seek out people who are already kind of open-minded and are interested in climate. And we intentionally sought out people that have like different cultural backgrounds, like so having a different cultural background, like, you know, being a child of an immigrant or speaking another language already kind of prepositions you in a way that you're more likely to be more accepting of different worldviews. So we intentionally sought out people with like diverse backgrounds for this workshop in particular. And that is a limitation. It's not very scientific, and we kind of use our gut judgment a little bit. But if we were to do this with people that we don't know, you know, that transformative learning aspect is something we would have to consider.
Cool. Does anybody have any other closing questions or comments?
Thank you for sticking with us.
Yeah.
That was amazing.
Sharing.
It was great to hear and see. Thank you guys so much for sharing that. Really, really appreciate it.
Thank you for giving us the opportunity to show it.
Yeah, of course, my pleasure. And I've said this like each time and from the beginning, if there's ever any work that any of us feel is that would be of interest or would be helpful to get feedback on, please just send me a note and we can arrange a time. And then also, you know, if you have any colleagues or friends who you know might want to do similarly, yeah, just reach out. Super easy to set this up, and it's a great group. Thanks you guys for contributing and for everyone who participated, questions and all that kind of stuff. Good deal. Thank you.
Cool.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, everyone. Have a good weekend, and see you next week.
Sounds good.
Bye.